recording. Hello, my name is James Walker. I'm a photographer and I've been tasked with doing some time capsule content for the Coalfields Community Landscape Partnership. And this is a very experimental thing. It's the first time we've done it. So this is actually a recorded Zoom with Arthur McIver and Yvonne McFadden, who are the researchers and authors behind this amazing book that we can hopefully get back in focus at some point. I should maybe have practiced this. There we are. So it's Memory, Mining and Heritage Voices from the Ayrshire Communities. So I think it's probably fair to say that this exhibition, or the launch of this book was instrumental in creating the idea for this time capsule project. So it's fantastic to have you both along and as part of that. So just as a wee kind of formality, for the council and GDPR people of the future, are you both happy to be part of this and have this recording kept for posterity to be released onto the unsuspecting public in 25 years' time?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely, James.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. That's excellent. Thank you very much. So, it's a lovely book, and there's a few. I was going to show some pictures. I've highlighted some pictures. So I love the whole voices thing. I love the idea of the whole thing. And there's a few pictures in there that I was going to show and say, oh, I like this one in particular. But given the fiasco we've just had with getting the focus right, we'll maybe not do that. But this whole project is very much in that same vein. So it's your voices now for our voices now for the future generations, and it'll pop up on the council's website in 25 years, and people can see exactly what the project was and how it came about, and your thoughts and aspirations to that. So, Arthur, you said that you're involved right from the outset of this. So can you sort of do an introduction and sort of tell us how things came about?
Not sure, I'm sure, and thanks for asking us. The Scottish Oral History Centre, myself and Yvonne are involved in, set up in 1995. So, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And the centre operates as a kind of hub between academic and community oral history, and it was set up really to encourage oral history projects, to support oral history projects, both within the university and within the community. And we were approached, that is the Oral History Centre, by Colin MacDonald back in the day, representing the Coalfield Communities Landscape Partnership, asking if we would be interested in an oral history-based project on the lost villages of East Ayrshire. Colin came along to the centre, we had a chat, and we set things in motion. And one of the first things we did was to undertake a pilot project with Sam Purdy. Sam is a lovely man, ex-resident of Glenbuck, one of our original 6, I think, on mining villages that we wanted to focus on. And I interviewed Sam in the Oral History Centre, and he provided us with some lovely memories of growing up in Glenbuck, and about the village. He's really passionate about Glenbuck, and the preservation of Glenbuck and preservation of those stories associated with Glenbuck and villages similar to Glenbuck in East Ayrshire. So that's how it all started. On the initiative of Colin MacDonald. From those initial meetings, we put together a research proposal, which was accepted. And at that point, we were looking to recruit an oral historian to work on the project, effectively to run the project, which Yvonne has done, and that's what brought Yvonne on board. Have I missed anything, Yvonne?
I think that's everything.
So, Yvonne, are you the oral historian? Then is that your role?
Was, yes. So I was already at Strathclyde at the time, and I was working as a teacher at Strathclyde, and the job came up. And I'm not going to lie, at first I thought, what do I know about mining communities? And then I read it properly, and I realised it was really about people and home and also a bit landscape, which are things that I look at and enjoy looking at. So I applied and obviously got the job. And that was during the pandemic, so that was February 2021. Um, so when I first joined, we weren't allowed to do any interviews in person,
Yeah.
which for an oral history project, that was obviously quite challenging. So we had to wait a while, and I suppose we always call it pivoted. So we pivoted to online interviews. And the first couple of interviews I did one over the telephone, and I did, I think, two online in the end. I interviewed Alice Wallace, which was a very memorable interview. She lived in Benwat, and she wrote a book about her experience in Benwat as well. So I'd read the book and I interviewed her, and it was fantastic. It was a wonderful experience. She was a great interviewee, so that was my first interview for the project. And then I interviewed Eddie McGee, who's lives in Auchinleck, but it's one of those things, he actually knows my father-in-law, so I still see Eddie just every now and again. And he was wonderful as well. He actually is, I think, the last quote in our whole book. And he came from a mining community, and then he was the parish priest in kind of one of the um, settlement communities. So when the people moved down from Lefton Hill, they were settled in Patna, and he was the parish priest in Patna. So it was just really interesting perspectives to get. Yeah, and that's really kind of where it all started. So it took a while. I don't think we interviewed people in person for quite a long time, wasn't it, Arthur? Was it maybe October 2021 might have been when we did our first bunch of interviews, and we all had masks on, didn't we?
Uh,
Um, and yeah, it was a kind of unusual experience to say the least. Yeah, so that kind of, I think that, I suppose, delayed the project a little bit, didn't it? So we had to kind of focus on, I suppose, we'll try to find archival stuff. And lots of people got in touch and sent us, people sent in their autobiographies, photographs, and we recruited some volunteers. One of them designed our logo that became our project logo, which was wonderful, so beautiful, really delighted with it. Um, Other people donated their, as I was saying, their pictures, their research. Some people donated their research they've been doing on the former mining communities. Um, yeah, so we had, and some of them did some interviews as well, which obviously we've got on record. But yeah, and so that was kind of, I suppose, the early days of the project. I think were quite challenging. I did an online talk for Cumnock, Cumnock History Group. I remember doing that. And I think the big message, I suppose, that we decided on early on in the project was that a lot of mining histories focus on men and masculinity. So one of our big drives with the kind of earlier stuff that we did was to just get the message out that we wanted to talk to women and children as well, and that it was a whole community we were looking at and not just the miners. So I went on, BBC Radio Scotland invited me to a show called Time Travellers, which I'd been on before they invited me to come on and talk about it. And there's kind of a funny story there actually. So I came on, I did the radio piece, and then I got contacted by Sean Gray, who's a songwriter who works with Rab Wilson, who's a Scots poet in the area. And he said, I heard you on the radio and I had to stop the car because I'm putting one of Rab's poems about Ben Watt called Ghasts. I'm putting it to music and it's about Ben Watt. And there you are on the radio talking about Ben Watt. He said, I couldn't believe it. So from then on, we kind of worked with Rab and Sean as well, and they performed at some of our events actually. So that was kind of an interesting way that relationship came about, just from hearing me on the radio. He got in touch. So that was kind of the early days of the project. We did that with an article in the Scotsman, and people got in touch with us through those things. But I think a big emphasis was this idea that we want to look at women's lives, men's lives, children, families, whole community perspective. So not just the miners and going down the mine. It's not. I mean, that was great. We did speak to miners, and that was a wonderful part of the project as well. But it was kind of trying to get that message out. And recently, I just did the maths in Arthur, and it turns out we were pretty much split between men and women in terms of our interviews. So I
Oh,
think it was 28 women and 27 men. So I was really delighted to work that out. But that was in the early days, I suppose, the things that we did during the pandemic when we couldn't actually go out into the community and interview people and run events and things like that. So,
Yeah.
You
So,
probably noticed, James, in relation in the book, we tried to flip around the emphasis in the book. So it starts with living in the miners' rows and leisure and the working lives of women, and then moves on to the working lives of men and the impact of pit closures and the like. Um, yeah.
yeah. So, um, one of the things that's quite striking, a lot of the pictures in the book are quite old, which is fantastic, and it seems to be that an easy impression to make was that all of these villages were lost decades ago, like 100 years ago. But there are pictures in there of people who are back on site, and there's pictures. I think there's one of the Barony in the 1950s, and then someone standing there, like much more recently. So were you able to catch a fair number of sort of residents of the lost villages? Is there a fair number of them still around, or were they kids at the time, or were they adults at the time, or just to get a sense of the time scale and the people that you've spoken to, are they relating memories or actual experiences of having
So I think
been?
it's
so
fair to say there's a mix of one, isn't there,
yeah.
of ex-residents and the children, the siblings, the sons and daughters of residents.
Yeah.
Yeah, so um, I'm not going to lie, when we started the project, we did have a sense that it's probably 10 years too late,
Mm.
just with the age of people. But we did, I mean, we spoke to Tam Hazel, who sadly passed after we interviewed him. And he was a fair age, he was in his 90s, so he talked to us about Glenbuck. So he was a young man in Glenbuck. So I'd say we spoke to people who were young. There was some people that were young adults. A lot of people were children. So we've got a lot on childhoods, which is lovely. But what also people told us the stories. So I would say Alice Wallace, in terms of women's experiences. So Alice used to meet with her mum and her mum's friends when they were elderly. She would take her mum to visit them, basically, and they would tell Alice and talk about all the old times up in Glen Watt. Sorry, so from Alice, we got a lot of her mum's stories and her mum's friends' stories. And she laughed and said, "These are the only ones I could actually tell you, though, because there was many more." So Alice, in a sense, gave us a real glimpse into, I suppose, women's lives on a daily basis from those wonderful stories that she had, that she'd passed, that her mum had told her and her mum's friends had told her, that were kind of passed down. So we had that. We had two interview forums actually. Like we've kind of scheduled. We don't have an interview questionnaire as such. It was more just a general topics we want to ask people about. But we had one for what we called descendants. So people who were remembering their mum or their dad came from the village or their auntie, and they were telling us their stories. And then we had people who were there as children or as young adults, and they told us kind of that was a different kind of interview. We would ask them about their experiences and what they remember about growing up and the Rose. So the Rose, so they're built in the 1840s, roughly 1840s, 1850s.
Mhm.
By the time we were the point we're looking at it really is we're talking about the earliest or the youngest people we interviewed in terms of being born it was the 1930s. Some people were born in the 1930s in the Rose, so that's as far back as we've got
Okay.
with the Rose, to be honest. So that we're really talking about, we're looking at people in that kind of 40s and 50s and people who remember as children moving out of their old villages and what it was like to live, I suppose, and everyone's getting kind of gradually moved out. So we're really at the end of life of the rural villages is what we looked at. So that was kind of where we focused. And then I should say, like, so initially the focus was really on getting these stories about the Rose and the Row villages. But as the project progressed and we talked to community more as well, it then became a bit more about the deindustrialization story, didn't it, Arthur?
Mm.
I would
Yep.
say, like, as it kind of progressed, it became more about, what was it like to have been moved into the social housing? What was it like when the mine shut? What was the community like? So it kind of we changed later on, I suppose, to look more at that kind of deindustrialization
Mm.
aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that would be a fascinating time, and not necessarily in a good way, because I suspect there wasn't a lot of hope around. They would see one mine shut after the other, and kind of see the process, sort of going in one direction, and sort of wondering what they're going to do. So I mean, I don't have a personal connection to the mines, but I'm aware of it. In fact, one of the things we spoke about at the book launch was the miners' strikes, and then I remember going down to Hunterston, and seeing the coal trucks coming in and out, and that was people fighting for their future, and it was, that wasn't lost on even me at the time, and the sort of wider Ayrshire community. I'm sort of North Ayrshire, so I mean we could see all this happening, but it must have been a real sort of traumatic time, I would imagine, for those that were directly involved.
For sure, James, and that came out of, as Yvonne's mentioned, that came out of a lot of the stories. A sense of a sense of being thrown on the scrap heap, to use that term. A sense of being worthless, of lacking any sort of identity when the mine shut. But one of the really interesting thing, I think, one of the really interesting things that came through the project was, looking at this through the lens of women in the family.
Mm.
Some of the stories around how families were affected by deindustrialization. What sticks in my head is a fragment of one of the things that sticks in my head, a fragment of the interview from Rab Wilson, where he spoke. Rab Wilson was an ex-miner, who then became a mental health nurse. So he was really in a really good position to comment on the health impacts of pit closures. And Rab spoke quite poignantly about the devastation in the community, the mental health effects of losing work, issues around increasing poverty and difficulties within families, and the drug culture that affected some of these communities. And that came through some of our other interviews and encounters, not least with the drug recovery group. But yeah, Rab spoke very poignantly about that, and also mentioned some of the sort of darker side of things, something that's, or some of the things that are not recorded very very frequently, including the prevalence of tensions and violence, domestic violence within families, some families, as a consequence of that sense of emasculation and feeling worthless on the part of men, and how that might have translated into these heightened tensions. Of course, yeah, which existed in many families. In a conversation with Yvonne about this, Yvonne reminded me that middle class families, of course, certainly are not immune to issues around tension and violence within the family context. But there are all sorts of issues which arose from the interviews in relation to the deleterious impacts of deindustrialization. And there were also some stories that were a bit more positive, and so it was really interesting the way these different narratives and stories came through. We heard from people who commented that the end of the pits meant the end of danger and ill health and exposure to dust and such things in the mine. So there were a range of stories, and a kind of real richness that came through those stories, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, and there was a generational impact as well, like in the sense of, so while we had a lot of stories about the camaraderie down the mines and that their dad loved working in the mine and that kind of thing, a lot of people said that their parent didn't want that for them
Yeah.
as young men. So there was a lot of kind of like they didn't want their own sons to go down the mine. So we heard that story quite a few times, didn't we, Arthur, of just this. So although they would loved being a miner and it was a great part of their identity and their life, they didn't want the same for their sons. So there was that kind of generational story as well, which was quite interesting around closure. So which was quite interesting. And then also as we spoke to younger people as well, like when we said what was it like when the mines shut, they actually interpreted that as the open cast mines, which was quite interesting. And
Yes,
that led us down a whole new kind of line of inquiry, I suppose. And they talked about the loss of the open cast because some of them worked in the open cast and the impact that had on them, but also the impact that it had in the community. Obviously, when people aren't coming down and getting their roll at lunchtime or on the way up, like these kind of things, like things start to shut because you've not got that same kind of, experience. But then also another thing that then emerged, because we're talking about deindustrialization within the wider mining communities, was there was also a sense that there was kind of factory work as well and that a lot of women worked in these factories,
the
and
support
then
of
there was a sense
in
that in
mind.
the 90s, the 2000s, these start to shut as well in the community. So you've got waves. So it's like these mining communities, there's waves and waves, of closures, which affects different generations and affects people, and obviously people have different genders differently. So I mean, there's a lot more to follow up on, I think, is fair to say, from the
That
project.
was
Although our initial focus was on that early history, that 40s, 50s, 60s, it really did kind of really branch out into Arthur.
Did
And I think
did
that kind of leads nicely to what I was thinking there. I mean, obviously, what the Coalfields Community Landscape Partnership is about restoring those communities that were lost and restoring bonds and sort of restoring that identity and sort of looking forward and using money that's coming to the area now, through tourism and wind farm developments in particular, they seem to be quite lucrative. So did you get a sense towards the end that people did have a renewed sense? Are they looking forward, or is it all kind of backwards looking?
Mm.
I know
It's a good question.
that might be slightly unfair because I know that wasn't part of your project, but it was just to see whether there was, and just off the cuff, you don't need evidence or anything.
there was
Did you get some kind of sense that that was happening, or was that really not your focus?
I think there was connected to that. I think there was a real sense that people wanted to tell their stories and to have their memories captured,
Yes,
and got a sense of the importance of that and the significance of that. Recording those voices and having them archived for posterity.
sure,
And in a sense, I think there was a sense on the part of many narrators that they got something out of it. They got something personally out of telling their story, maybe a sense of worth from that.
sure.
Um,
I mean, I think it's a fantastic project, and I'm conscious that I'm eating into your time. We've got a few minutes left, but the question I always ask everyone at the end, so if you could each give me like a wee minute or something, just on that is just like, what are your hopes for the future? I know that this is very much a historical work, but that doesn't mean to say that there's not some sense of hope or aspiration for the future. If you could sort of comment on that, that'd be great.
well,
I'll
shall I lead
go.
on this?
I think, like, I suppose in terms of our project, like, which was about capturing these voices, it was about creating a story. We always looked at like looking after what we call the intangible heritage. So while like Historic Scotland might look after the buildings and the old ruins and things like that, we were looking after the kind of memories, and making sure these places don't just disappear. So for us, I think an important part was the archiving. It was having the exhibition out there so that people could see their history. I mean, going to getting the exhibition at the National Mining Museum Scotland was huge because it meant East Ayrshire. They admitted themselves they got very little on East Ayrshire in their archive. They don't interact with East Ayrshire that much. So to have that, to have those people's stories at a national kind of audience, I think was really important. I was really delighted that we were able to make that happen. So I think going forward, I think it's just, I would like to see people reading the book. I would like to see schools, anybody, researchers using the materials we collected, but also I'd like to hope that our project can be an inspiration for other people, local people, to continue to tell their stories, to record their stories, to keep it alive, basically. So that's my hope. My hope is that people continue to use the resource we created, but also to add to it, to see that their voices do matter and they can tell their stories to each other or record them, whatever they want to do.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Arthur, what's your
Oh,
thoughts?
I completely agree with that. James, I'd just add that, perhaps it would be nice as a legacy if the importance of oral history was recognised in Ayrshire, perhaps even beyond. But one thing we suggested as part of the legacy was that there might be the appointment of a local oral historian or a curator to carry on these kinds of stories, to record people's memories in Ayrshire, and that would be quite nice as a legacy to see oral history developed at a more in a more systematic way to record people's stories.
And thinking about this being 25 years later, then Arthur, it'd be really interesting to see if any of that is, if there is more kind of oral
that's
history and recording people's stories.
exactly, that's exactly it.
You'll be around when I won't be. So
Fingers crossed.
what happens.
So that's great. Absolutely. Thank you both so much for your time. This has been really interesting, really valuable. And I'm just going to stop the recording now, and then we've got a couple of minutes just to chat. So
Thank you,
both
James.
so much.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting us, Jim.
You're welcome.